Cool. All right, Mike. So thanks for talking to me, because I've been very curious by the Beatles since reading about, not because my mom was a diehard Beatles fan, really because I had read some of Lyndon LaRouche's EIR, Executive Intelligence Review, and Dope Inc., books like that. And basically going back to the 60s, 70s time period, they were calling out the Beatles and this whole British invasion as literally a British invasion, as far as the intention of what they were considering, the propagation of mind controls, the sex, drugs, rock, basically mind control techniques of hysteria. Obviously we knew that with the Beatles, the mass hysteria created around the concerts, and the music basically changing the nature of music, moving in. I think it was like basically sort of designed to be 12 tone, but as a 12 tone.
Yeah.
Yeah, but essentially moving like the progressions into very what's called modern day pop, right? Essentially like meant to be very like catchy, hypnotic, sort of a complete break from any classical musical traditions. And obviously we know the jazz and things like this had already been around, but this was popularizing en masse certain things that even as we know, people like the Frankfurt School, like Adorno and people like that, were writing about, with this concept of pop, the top 40 music that you could basically play over and over on the radio and get people to buy into that idea of like, these are the popular songs right now, and they have to be short, not like a symphony or a concerto. They've got to be like 3 minute. Right. And the Beatles fit right into that, that classification, essentially, of transforming the nature of music and how we engage with music. Obviously rock and roll had already been around and doing a similar thing, but the Beatles almost perfected it in a way that was a huge, as we know, international phenomenon. So having heard all these things from EIR and read these articles about how the Tavistock Institute, which is sort of the hub of mind control studies for the British Empire, going back to the First World War even, was very much involved in creating the Beatles. I'm very curious to start with this big question of how much were the Beatles a creation of Tavistock, let's say, in the sort of the British establishment?
Entirely. The Beatles were 100% created by Tavistock, as well as the entire British invasion, Sean, and all genres of music that followed. Each genre of music has an agenda. There's a point that they're trying to drive home, that they're trying to condition people with, in order to move their agenda forward. And the agenda is social engineering. It was to move away from what most people would call the traditional values, especially with regard to Christianity. And so the Beatles really kicked that off. And we can argue that it went before the Beatles with Elvis and so on, but the big push with the British invasion started with the Beatles. So the Beatles were 100% a creation of Tavistock.
Great. So how do we get to that? Let's start with your investigation, really. How do you get to that conclusion? Give us some of the major elements that you've discovered along the way.
Well, the first piece of it is that there is an agenda. So there is a one world initiative, and it is based in Aleister Crowley's Aeon of Horus. Other people will know it as the Age of Aquarius, the New Age, pick your terminology, but it's really based in Crowley's Aeon of Horus. And so the controllers, in order to make the Aeon of Horus a reality, to push it forward, they needed to have tools, big tools, in order to change the very fabric of our culture and our societies. And so they had the Beatles on the radar for a very long time. Now, some people will ask me, at what point do you think the Beatles became a product of Tavistock? And my answer is 1960 for sure, when they were in Hamburg. But I believe it's possible that it goes even beyond that, that the Beatles themselves, and specifically biological Paul McCartney and John Lennon, may have been, and I say may have been, in mind control programs. and they were handled and brought along. And you know how this works. There's this whole grooming process that takes place. And so Tavistock put them together, and there were three phases of the Beatles. There was the Hamburg Beatles, which included Stu Sutcliffe and Pete Best. And then the 62 to 66 Beatles, where we had John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr, biological Paul McCartney. And phase three was the Billy period, the Billy Shears period, where Billy playing the part of Paul, John, George, and Ringo. So
we'll get into that story.
Yeah, we'll get into that. Yeah. So the Beatles were put in place in order to break down the cultural and societal norms at the time. And they did it in a way that was very methodical. It was very incremental. For many people, it wasn't very shocking, maybe to the adults, to the older folks it was, but for the younger folks, the younger generation, no, they just soaked it right up. And it was to pull people away from the societal structures that their parents were accustomed to. And that was the beginning, the very beginning of the 1960s is when Crowley's Eon of Horus was, in my opinion, being pushed very hard going forward. And now it's 60 years later.